Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strohan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Joining the Dots. Today we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by Nick Sharp, Deputy Director at the National Economic Crime Centre, or the NEC for short. The NEC are responsible for coordinating the UK's response to economic crime. This is all about the UK's biggest, most complex, large-scale economic threats, which inevitably have strong links to organised international crime. Nick has a pretty unique view of the scale of the fraud threat and also the impact on victims across the UK. And this is where we're going to be focusing quite a lot of our attention today. Nick has a strong pedigree in this space, both in his current role at the NEC, but also at HMRC, where he has held several senior roles tackling organised economic crime. I also see your experience is in leading investigation teams as well as intelligence teams, which is another dynamic that I've picked up from our podcasting, because you come to appreciate the nuances of being reactive to events, but then also the importance of getting upstream in a proactive way. So that's also useful for these kind of conversations. So Nick, welcome to Joining the Dots.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks very much for having me and for coming in to see us at the NCA today.
Yes, well, so I'm saying welcome, and in fact, really, you should be welcoming us to your offices, so thank you for having us as well. Let's kick off. Should we start with a bit of your background? What got you into this? What are your motivations for doing what you do, etc.?
Sure. So I joined civil service straight from uni. There's actually a conversation in my kitchen with a friend who said, you'd be quite good working in an airport. I think he was possibly trying to make fun of me, but I was like, that is quite an interesting idea. And went to the Customs and Excise website. I think I was in my final year, so I sort of started to think about jobs. And it said they were recruiting to the fast stream. So I was thinking about a graduate programme, and it was that or the prison service, weirdly or not. And just went through the process and started to find people all the way through the interviews, the assessment centres, who I'd never really come across, haven't come from like a public service family or anything like that. There's one military person, but they're mainly financial sector. So I started to find people that I really connected with. So I started to think, well, this is a natural place for me. Entered HMRC as it had become the merger of Customs and Excise and the Inland Revenue. So desperate to work in an airport was where I started.
Right.
I wanted to be in the channels, working with the public, but also kind of that environment of trying to find criminals. And the first job they gave me was in human resources in an office in Nottingham. So it was a little bit of a system shock.
And you a Nottingham lad, or
Not
no?
at all, no.
Where are you sort of?
So I'm from the southwest, and
Right.
I'd never been to Nottingham in my entire life. So did take the job, and whilst that wasn't where I ever saw my career going, starting in human resources in a very large organisation gave me a really good grounding in leadership and management. So you kind of know the rules, what's law, what's policy, what's guidance, and HR, there's a lot more interpretation, I think, than people realise. So it wasn't what I dreamt of, but I don't have any regrets of working there. But then quite swiftly moved across into intelligence. I got some amazing advice in my 8th week, I think. Someone said, if you want to be a senior leader in law enforcement, you have to do the job, which is really difficult when you're on a graduate entry scheme because they quickly move you beyond the frontline work. So luckily I got that advice early, so sort of held back as long as they let me, and then worked on all the kind of classic surveillance and made sure I was fully trained and did an investigation, which was into tax fraud, which was the kind of common denominator for the 17 years that followed, but really started in intelligence, moved into the international space. Quite common to public sector fraud, but really all fraud, and I'm sure we'll talk about this again today, there's always an international element of organised crime, be it cashing out, where the victim is, where the criminal is, where the asset ends up that they're trying to acquire. Organised criminality and international go hand in glove. So it was helpful to have a bit of time there, and then kind of went into that head office environment, working for one of our executives during the 2010 coalition government being formed, which was a really, my kind of introduction to a head office environment and how politics met the civil service and the real role of the civil service. So that was kind of a coming of age, I guess, in terms of my career, and kind of seeing 80-20 rules and all this kind of stuff, which was really interesting. But then most of the time after I finished the graduate scheme was spent in leadership positions in intelligence and investigation, and that Director General's advice to me, it's kind of parting advice, I think almost at his retirement party, was don't stay in one or the other for too long. Keep jumping over the fence between both. So in intelligence, as you describe at the start, you're very much a supplier, and in investigation, you're a customer, is the best way to describe it. And just loved working in both, with human intelligence sources, and then in investigation. The way my career went is I came closer and closer to economic crime. It wasn't by design. I'm sort of interested in criminality, but I ended up in HMRC because I went on that website. I ended up in financial crime because that's just where the investigations I did, the accountabilities I had took me, and entered the senior civil service as the Deputy Director for Economic Crime, which was thinking about primarily money laundering and the proceeds of crime relating to tax fraud, which includes things like excise smuggling as well as tax on the VAT system, self-assessment. I'm not a tax-trained person, but I know enough about it that if there's criminal tax on that system, you need to know how it operates. But ultimately, you're running in the criminal justice system. And that brought me into the contact with the National Economic Crime Centre, which is a multi-agency, multi-sector team who are looking at economic crime across the entire law enforcement operational landscape, and then interacting with policy departments and officials, ministers, really subject matter expertise. So I was a stakeholder of the NEC, used to second staff over to work in it, so HMRC had its footprint here. They were within my team. And then an opportunity came up to move across into the National Crime Agency. So only 18 months ago, I moved across and became the fraud lead. So really, and what I think most of our conversation will be about is fraud against individuals. That's where most of our strategic effort is. Yeah. But all of my experience before was in public sector fraud, and ultimately the strategies that you use to deal with like big tax frauds and running into the billions, and a big crime type which runs into the millions, they're not entirely different. And what works in tax is completely transferable to work on countering fraud, in my view. We're still going through the motions of how far can we take some of that thinking and learning. But the NEC itself is made up of people from law enforcement backgrounds, civil service backgrounds, banking, third sector, security services. They're all here, international people are here. And the idea is you bring all those ideas together, and you can hopefully come out with a strategic impact on the problem of economic crime. So that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, I mean, you just can't tackle it at one agency at a time. Public sector without private sector, it's one of those challenges, isn't it? So I wonder if you might be able to give us a bit of a feel for the magnitude of the challenge with the economic crime and fraud in the UK.
Yeah. So economic crime will start there, which is the broadest descriptor. And in there, money laundering, sanctions evasion, bribery and corruption. Money laundering alone probably equates to £100 billion a year. That's in the NCA's National Strategic Assessment. There'll be people who will be listening to say that's the kind of minimum amount it is. In terms of like evidence-based, intelligence-based, it's at least that.
I've heard trillions globally.
Yeah, you kind of get bottom down and top down and bottom up interpretations of this. It will be somewhere in the middle is my assessment. But the reason it's so big is it's the proceeds of all crime. So in terms of criminality, and I mean global geopolitical criminality, not just UK domestic, some money just flows through our country, assets are acquired here, other money disappears from our country and never touches us, and it's actually our money being stolen. So tax fraud proceeds of crime is in there. All like drug dealing, immigration, they're all part of the money laundering mission.
Yeah.
And money is totally agnostic of sector. So I really agree with what you just said about it's a public and private problem. Well, money doesn't care about bureaucracy, and criminals don't. They just think, I want to take the gains of my illicit activity and enjoy those. So you need to launder that somehow. So that is an enormous mission which the NEC is involved in. But there is one particular predicate offence which we are also interested in, or directed to deal with, which is fraud against individuals and businesses. So public sector fraud is dealt with very well, very professionally by large public sector organisations, HMRC, DWP, National Health Service, MOD. They all have their kind of own fraud groups, marshalled to an extent by the Public Sector Fraud Authority. But they know what they're doing. They've got their own powers, their own capabilities. They can take stuff end to end. They don't rely on traditional policing or National Crime Agency for much of it. We do obviously do bits and pieces, but they can be kind of left to their devices, collaborate where needed. When it comes to fraud against individuals, which is the most common crime experienced in the country, so the Crime Survey of England and Wales comes out every quarter. It's Office of National Statistics, so it's not government statistics. It's the most concrete and sound evidence base we have of what's happening out there in the community, because there is a massive underreporting issue globally. It's not unique to the UK. Most people who are victims of fraud don't report that to the police. Many report to their banks. People report to slightly different people for various reasons. Do you want to just get your money back? Do you have any faith that anything's going to happen? Sometimes people feel embarrassed. There's all sorts of motives of why people don't report. Yeah. It's a grossly underreported problem, but the Office of National Statistics work isn't based on did you report it or not. It's based did you experience it or not. And it's been running since 2018, so it's probably the best yardstick we have to see how the threat is evolving and changing from a public perspective. So that sits today at 3.9 million fraud incidents a year, and that's against 2.9 million victims. So some victims are defrauded multiple times, is why there's a slight discrepancy in the number. Yeah. This does shift around quite significantly. It was at its absolute peak during COVID, during the pandemic. Few reasons for that. All of our lives moved much more online, and I don't know if you use the expression COVID keepers. So there's things which happened during COVID which have not been undone, which because they were quite good. Yeah. Example in my community is our dump. You have to now book to go and see. You used to be able to rock up. Actually, it's made the whole thing a much more orderly, orderly experience. So COVID Keeper, though, across like at social level, was most of our lives have remained online. So
Teams has been something that it has been useful. We don't have to travel as much. There's more acceptance that we can do more stuff online for sure. I see that.
And hybrid working, lots of debate in corporate circles about how far do you tolerate or how far do you enforce, and there's a sweet spot in the middle. But the idea of hybrid working, it wasn't totally alien before COVID. People would work at home one day a week or a fortnight. It became, some businesses, as you'll know, are full-time at home or one day a month. Yeah. So much more of our working lives, our personal lives, moved on the internet. At the same time, the faster payment system has come. Where you have the faster payment system, which is, in total layperson's terms, is where there is an instant connection between bank, me paying you for an item, the money leaving my bank and entering your bank. It's like not through the back system, which takes a few days to clear. It's an instant process, so good for economies. But where you have faster payments, you tend to have higher instances of fraud. So we've got more online, and Brits spend more of their time online than Americans and Europeans, for whatever cultural reason, I don't know, but that is just how things are here. Faster payments, and then speaking English makes us a hard target for many, many criminals who operate overseas. So it's not a uniquely English-speaking problem. In the Chinese-speaking world, there is absolutely tons of scams. They use the language of scams more than fraud. There's scam centres all through the continent, Asia, Southeast Asia, and there's lots of collaboration and cooperation, but ultimately that's targeting Chinese-speaking victims. Other groups target English-speaking victims. So if you're in a country with faster payments online and you speak English, you would expect there to be a surge in fraud, and that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. Post-pandemic, lots of great controls have been put in place. So whilst you might still receive phone calls and texts and emails from illicit people, I've almost had one from myself. Not quite. I had one which they said, we're Revenue and Customs, you owe us money and we're going to come and raid your house. And I was running organised crime operations in Revenue and Customs at the time. So it was like really bizarre to kind of receive a call from your own organisation, a fraud. And it's kind of like...
And it was a call.
It was a phone call. Now I've started to notice those are like almost robotic voices, presumably using some kind of... scripting or a bot to generate a call rather than a person. But some of those still get through the system, but millions and millions are blocked.
I mean, I don't answer my phone anymore. If there's a number that I don't recognise, I don't answer it because, well, one, it's probably going to be a salesperson trying to sell me primarily, which I'm less interested in. But secondly, because I've been targeted by fraudsters, so it's kind of changed the way we perceive, isn't it? This fraud.
And that's just... It's just really sad, isn't it? I feel exactly the same in my life. If it's a withheld number or a number I don't know, my brain goes straight to, this is probably nothing. Because I have a family, I do have to pick it up just in case something, you kind of think, oh, what's happened? Or is that like a school or whatever? In Singapore, where scams are like a national conversation, it's like a major crime. It's only 4 million people, but... so they have a lot more kind of control of that narrative, and they can bring it to the whole public's attention much more easily. They are incredible at what they do, and their telephone infrastructure means that I think everyone has a spam filter on their phone device, and it says, unless that number's been registered with the central government, this is probably a scam, like on the caller ID. So that's how far that's gone. Trying to combat this idea, because socially we don't want to live in a world where people don't want to talk to each other or talk to strangers, but that is the consequence of this and the harm that it does. Now, for yourself and me, we might feel like we can filter those calls, we'd spot them a mile off. Lots of people who work in counter fraud do still fall victim, sometimes really heavily targeted by more sophisticated scams and attacks. But so many victims of fraud lose complete confidence in even like leaving their home, speaking to a stranger, shopping online. And I heard a really interesting line from a Met police officer recently who compared this to if you get mugged in a park and you lose your phone, well, you can avoid going to that park ever again. You can choose to not walk that way. You can choose to walk around it. If you lose everything online, you can't not live your life online. You possibly could. It's not very easy. But you can't avoid the internet. You can't really purchase things. You can't buy gifts. You can't get paid. You can't get to your banking for lots and lots of people. So it can be a catastrophically harmful fraud. And that was the real difference between working in public sector fraud and here with fraud against individuals. The public sector fraud is very much driven by recovering financial loss or preventing financial loss in the first place. When it comes to individuals, it's not just a case of money, because frankly, a very low-level loss, you might lose £50. To someone, £50 is their food bill for the month.
Yeah.
They're not going to eat. So not only can people lose confidence socially, they can lose a catastrophic level of money just by being defrauded from like almost the most straightforward, you bought a mug off me and I didn't send it to you. You've literally been defrauded, and maybe you couldn't afford to not get that.
And we hear these large numbers around the billions of fraud, the millions of referrals, but sometimes when we think about how we combat this, these numbers don't land. They don't hit a psyche of us going, well, actually, shit, this is a problem. Whereas I think maybe where you're going with this conversation is, let's think about the victims here. These large-scale frauds and the economic crime has a real impact, and you see that on the front line. Is that a way to start to get this into the psyche of the nation in terms of how we can tackle it?
I think so. So national conversation, as I mentioned, happens in some countries. It's increasingly happening here. There is amazing victim support. We now have a fraud minister. It's a government fraud strategy. BBC do like a scam week every year. The Scam Intercept is usually a popular show. It's becoming more into the public psyche. However, it's one of those things like a terms and conditions. Like when you buy your new TV and you just want to watch TV, but you've got to cycle through the kind of blue text of, or if you buy a new phone, you have to go through the terms and conditions. And, you know, everybody realises most users don't meticulously analyse every line of that. They scroll to the bottom, they press next, and then they're away. And I think the danger we have with fraud is we're constantly trying to remind people to, you know, the government campaigns called Stop Think Fraud. It's a really nice simple message, which is to try and intercept that. You're on the kind of fraudsters' journey. They're trying to get that money extracted from you. And when you really look into how scams operate, it's kind of like sales. You know, they kind of do the nudge, and then they build a rapport, and then they create the kind of urgency and take you all the way through that. And it's trying to work out how to get someone to recognise it when it's happening. That's based on victim experience, but also just not engaging with it and being able to filter between this is definitely fraud and this definitely isn't, or to just maybe kill a phone call, phone up your bank and say, am I really talking to you right now? But the danger is, you know, in the people I bank with, I'm just trying to see, I don't know, did that money come out for a taxi or something? But then it says like 4 pop-ups. Oh, did you know that investment fraud's a problem? And it's like, yeah, I do, and I'm interested, but right now, this isn't the time to talk to me. So there's lots of good messaging out there, and there's some national conversation. It's almost just trying to work out how do we resist the temptation to kind of overload people to the point they become word blind, and then almost not target hard, and, you know, with all best intentions to stop them being defrauded, but equally, if you overdo it, then you kind of lose the message as well.
Yeah. And what about another angle? This is perhaps a theory I have more than anything else. But one of the challenges with fraud, I think, is I see it being glamorized to a degree. You know, you see influencers online who are proud of the gaming the system and showing their riches, and you have people in the public sphere. Again, boasting and saying, "Well, no, this isn't fraud. This is smart business. You know, this is entrepreneurialism. This is." So you've got that sort of message, and then you've got the fact that it's just low risk. You know, it's like it's not like robbing a bank, obviously, because you're going to take a lot of risk doing that. But you know, to be sitting at your desk, in a quiet room, you know, looking on the dark web, sort of finding these things and executing frauds. It just feels like it's quite accessible. It feels like a cultural issue where people feel as if they can do this. Is there something in that?
Yeah, so there's loads in that. It's not an unfair statement in terms of how the risk is perceived in the underworld. Interestingly, you look at the dark web and the clear web. Loads of fraud happens in the clear. Not even an attempt to mask that it's fraudulent activity. Such is the scale of the issue. There's kind of 2 things to say on this. One is it's really important that we continue to catch, prosecute and imprison fraudsters to create a meaningful deterrent. And it does happen, but equally there's only a finite amount of time. You know, we are very open in saying we do think when sentencing is made for fraud, that it shouldn't just be about how much financial loss there was to the victim. This is what I was mentioning earlier. This is now in the sentencing guidelines. How much harm did it do to the individual? What are the kind of other consequences beyond financial loss? So there is a meaningful deterrent. There's more law enforcement activity all the time. I'll talk to you about some of the stuff that's happened just this week, or that we've just gone to press about this week. So there's a role to play in terms of meaningful deterrence, genuine prosecution, but because there's a lot of offending, there's lots of different crime types, ultimately in the criminal justice system it has to kind of absorb all of that. So we have to make sure that when we are taking someone through court, to affect getting it as far as a jury to then make that kind of reasonable decision either way, or based on the evidence. That we take the right cases. So a lot of our energy is spent not just working on, and this is a kind of a big shift in the last few years, not this one-to-one victim. So, Thomas, you got ripped off by Nick. I'm going to arrest Nick and give you your money back. Actually, who ripped off 1,000 people or 10,000 people or 100,000 people, and how do we get all of their money back? So sometimes you'll see this really basic division where people say, well, X many victims divided by Y many prosecutions equals this percent, and that's not enough. Now, that's not enough, I don't disagree with, but it's not a simple case of prosecutions divided by victim numbers, because some prosecutions represent 1 million victims. So that would kind of distort the figures completely. So it's just not a helpful narrative, which it happens all the time, but it's just not a helpful narrative. It's about maximising the impact of that sort of work that we do. But this is why counter-fraud strategies can't be all about enforcement, because really the landscape you described there, you can only stop that by making it as good as impossible to undertake fraud. So if you're an influencer and you're selling some kind of dodgy investment scheme which is saying no, it's 100% legit, or I've created a crypto coin in my own name and I'm going to kind of swell the market and stuff, there's two things you can do with that. One is regulation. So we have Financial Conduct Authority who are increasingly enforcing against investment fraud, and very, very effectively, I might add. And the Online Safety Act, which is now, I think even during this week, and the guidance has switched on, would make that the people hosting that video, if that's quite clearly fraudulent, there's got to be some kind of accountability in for the person who's allowed the platform to be used as well. So, Ofcom are setting those standards. They're not enforced yet. They're very, very new. But all of those things that I described blended is how you counter that ultimate problem. I did want to mention the law enforcement results, because this is a really exciting week to be with us in the NCA, because two things have happened this week, which are really significant. So one, in terms of enforcement, we do an ongoing investigation which is right across the law enforcement system. So when we talk about law enforcement system, we mean police and all of the national agencies. So National Training Standards, FCA, SFO, NCA are the kind of main contributors to it. So we work all through the year, building up intelligence, building up cases, and then during the month of February this year, there is a surge of activity where we try and execute warrants into different investigations, but at the same period, and then collect all of that together. So the National Economic Crime Centre coordinate that, very closely affiliated with the City of London Police, our primary partner. So between us, we make this thing called Operation Henhouse take place, which is creating not just bad news for criminals, but creating a newsworthy event which enables us to remind the public, stop, think fraud, because the volume is scary. There's tons of fraud investigations happen all the time. They're very rarely going to be put into the public's consciousness unless you're in that particular community. So if you're in Bedford and the sweet shop gets raided, okay, that might make the local press, but it can be hard in fraud to bring our voice out there. So this is a really good opportunity. This year, 422 people arrested, and they got 7.5 million in cash and assets. So free activity, which I mentioned the money laundering numbers in the 100 billions. Okay, it might feel like scratching the surface, but equally that's victims' money, proceeds of crime, and actually lots and lots of people who are going to get prosecuted, and that does hopefully build the public's confidence that the police are active where they are. So
it plays to that deterrent, doesn't it?
Yeah, meaningful deterrent.
Yeah, that you will follow up on these things. There will be an impact. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I suppose the thing that I thought about earlier was how do you prioritise? So you mentioned about the getting the money back to the victims, which I guess is the most important thing. But does the impact, the psychological and mental impact of a certain type of fraud, play into your prioritisation?
Yes.
Sort of work at all?
That's a really good question. So, not all frauds are equal in harm. So, of course, there are variables within all of that. You might have some high mum scam where someone loses £20 or £200,000. So I'm not being dismissive of the 90 or so fraud types there are. But we do know there are some frauds which are higher harm than others, as in the average value is higher or the social impact is higher.
Yeah.
So those are impersonation frauds. So that is someone dresses up as a delivery driver, a police officer, person of trust, postman. They come to your door, they sell you a story, or they take your item off of you, they levy a fine. So, I mentioned getting a phone call from myself. You can imagine someone like breaking into a retirement home dressed as a policeman, knocking on every single door and saying, "Oh, you've got this penalty charge you need to pay." So that's a really harmful fraud, because it's it's taking advantage of people's trust right in the community. It's probably the most common UK domestic fraud, so the criminality happens here. So we do spend an awful lot of law enforcement effort countering that, largely through traditional policing and all the tactics that go with that. So that's one of the highest harm frauds. In the business world, something called business email compromise. There's quite a lot of variables within that. Examples are payment diversion fraud, chief executive fraud. Chief executive fraud is one that has happened to me, in that someone used my identity to try and make it happen. So this is when you say, Thomas has just emailed a very junior colleague to say, "Oh, it's a surprise, but I'm going to buy everybody a £50 iPhone voucher in the whole business. Don't tell anyone. It comes from your account, and then go and buy these vouchers, and then I want you to put them in this lockbox, and then we'll do the big reveal next week." So, understanding how hierarchy works, and the fact you might have a public profile, so any criminal can kind of work out a way to do that. Working that through, that individual then makes the purchases using the company's account, puts them in the lockbox, talks to the boss, goes, "Hey, big reveal," and like, "What are you talking about?" That's a form of business email compromise. So they've somehow penetrated the email system. Now they use social media. It recently happened to me, a LinkedIn page, which is I only use for corporate stuff. But ultimately, because of that public profile, someone attempted to use my LinkedIn, made a duplicate LinkedIn account, and then emailed member staff. Luckily, they broke to me internally and said, "What on earth are you talking about? You work in the public sector." Of course not. So that's a very high harm fraud, because it really undermines business.
Yeah.
And then there's two quite heavily and increasingly linked types of fraud. One is linked to the influencers you mentioned as a kind of source of a lot of this happening, is investment frauds. Most common in the public consciousness will be dodgy crypto schemes, £2,000 return, all this kind of stuff, and sensationalism. Investment frauds aren't just about crypto. There are multiple types of investment fraud. We have pension frauds, which can be enormous, like going after pension pots. Serious Fraud Office, Financial Conduct Authority, and ourselves very heavily involved in trying to counter that. The harm there tends to be bigger financially. So whilst I'm saying it's not all about finance, some of the average losses in investment fraud are enormous.
Yeah.
And then this links into romance fraud, which is some of the best victim groups out there, and there's lots of in the public narrative about this, which is not only driven financially. Sometimes it's driven by kind of sexual exploitation or even just a social exploitation of a person, but very often financial, really tapping into like online dating, loneliness, like increasing levels of loneliness can be there. And I think there's something called I can't remember what we call it now. It used to be referred to as pig butchering. We don't like that phrase, which came out of some of the scam centres in Asia. This is the way it translates, but it's actually not. It's kind of hybrid fraud, I think, is a better way to describe it. But that's ultimately where someone builds a romantic relationship with a person, either over a very long period, but then to introduce them to investments.
Yeah. And
some of the examples I see are, you might have someone on a well-known dating website. Your first contact is, "Hi, I'm Nick. Hi, I'm Susan." Second contact is, "Hey, have you ever thought about investing in crypto?" And it's not so. Some of them are very long-winded over like years and years.
Yeah.
Some of them are that quick to market, and they'll be like, "How often?"
They're playing the numbers game.
When you were dating, or maybe still are, but do people introduce crypto investments to you on the first date? I don't think so, but that's the thing. So they play a numbers game, but also then they might use romance fraud to get access to a bank account to do money laundering through that account. And it's an exceptionally harmful one, and it can be really, really difficult for the victim to almost come to terms with the fact that they've been defrauded, sometimes of being in complete denial, that they're still there are people out there to this day who we know. I mean, Singapore police gave me this example. There was someone, they were able to give them the evidence that this person was scamming them, and they still wouldn't accept it.
Yep.
So that's just because it's getting into another part of our psyche, and it's very well written about. I do need to kind of give a nod to my victim support colleagues out there, because they are very clear that there is far too much victim blaming, specifically in romance fraud, but across the landscape, which I really do recognise. Even some of the language we use, there are toolkits out there about the reasons why we don't say it's too good to be true, why we don't say, I've had people contact me from overseas where local police officers said, it was really foolish of you. Sometimes that's how a family react to you, and that's why people don't want to say anything. But let's just be really clear, who's to blame in fraud. It's the criminal. It's not the victim. Yeah. So that person is manipulating, they're literally being dishonest to steal from somebody. So it's not, people shouldn't feel ashamed. Actually, certainly where I sit, there's one person to blame. It's the person who did that to you.
Yeah, and these people are very proficient at finding and exploiting vulnerabilities, whether they be in a financial scheme or whether they be in the psychological makeup of a victim.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, in a couple of months' time, we're going to be interviewing a victim of fraud, of romance fraud, who had a lot of what you're speaking about there. So we'll look out for that. So I wanted to move on, if I can, to touch a bit on the international aspect of fraud. Clearly, you've already spoken about it in certain ways, but I'm interested to initially get your view on international initiated fraud and how we might tackle it, and then I have a few follow-up questions I suspect to that.
Yeah, sure. So most fraud, I think it's 70% plus, the latest data from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, has some kind of international link. So that will be the fraudster is there, the proceeds are there, or some of the infrastructure they use to carry out the fraud is not based within our shores or jurisdiction. So that instantly creates an extra level of complexity in terms of catching and bringing the person, bringing them to justice, and recovering the money. So it's easily the hardest element we have. Now, it's good you're in the National Crime Agency for this conversation, because the National Crime Agency manages the global law enforcement liaison ultimately. So we do lots based in London, lots of embassies here, lots of overseas law enforcement officials here, but usually we have people out there amongst communities working with law enforcement in country. And it will be to facilitate cooperation. So there are treaties and there are very formal channels where you have to go through the courts, like court-ordered exchanges of evidence, intelligence. There's really lots and lots of process around it with our allies, very transparent, almost instantaneous data and victim data sharing and things are plausible. But the regions where fraud takes place are almost infinite. So we can't police the whole world. It's not our job. So we have to be strategic around it. And any fraud, could be in any country, and we would take it really, really seriously. But if you stack up all the frauds, well, where do they most likely emanate from? And then how do we work in that region or that nation to try and work with local law enforcement and find kind of the common factor? Because often the criminals who are defrauding us are also defrauding the domestic population as well.
Right.
So you're bound to ask me where, but the epicenters are for frauds which hit the UK are mainly in West Africa.
Yes.
So we work heavily with West African law enforcement and elected officials, and Asia, Southeast Asia as well. So call centres, we would have all experienced what some of those examples I gave earlier would have come from call centres in Asia and the Asian subcontinent. There is a growing narrative around scam cities and scam compounds,
yes,
which are numerous. They're all over the world, but there is a big concentration in Southeast Asia and close association with modern slavery and human trafficking. So some of the people, not all of the people, but some of the people who work in the compounds are trafficked into them, or they're held in captivity, and they have like quotas of how many victims they need to defraud. So that's a very, very serious emerging kind of concentration of scam centres. But at the end of the day, many people listening to this will be familiar with the concept of a boiler room. So a boiler room is literally, old school. There's 8 of us. We've got dodgy phones, and we're just going to try and spam everybody until we get some money. Ultimately, so boiler rooms have been happening for years, decades. This is almost like the industrialisation of boiler rooms. In terms of the direct harm on different nations, that has not trumped West Africa or other parts of Asia, but something that we're carefully watching, and a big part of the international community is starting to actively think about how do we deal with this problem, because that's not going to go away on its own.
I mean, I can sort of see, although we come on to it, how you cooperate with allies, but how do you tackle these sort of challenges in jurisdictions where we don't have a rich history of collaboration and sharing?
You'd be surprised, actually. So one thing I think is like universally common to all societies is everyone hates fraud. So it can be a place that we can collaborate on. So because it's just such a victim-centric theft of someone's property, I have found it's quite a good door to cooperation and collaboration. Not absolutely everywhere universally. You have geopolitical factors which kind of change it. But in terms of law enforcement to law enforcement, there's more cooperation possible than I think in other crime types, because it's there's nowhere on the planet where it's okay to defraud your fellow citizen.
A person.
Yeah.
It's like on the one hand, people can turn on a blind eye to money laundering because it's kind of somewhere in bank accounts over there somewhere.
Yeah.
But when it's, potentially your neighbour or your friend or your mother or your grandmother, there's a commonality in culture that okay, that's interesting. Okay, so I suppose it'd be remiss of me to not ask the question around, what's happening in the world, coming into the second Trump term, 50, 60 days in, this sort of nationalism wave that is sort of starting to sort of punctuate the world. Are you finding any of the reverberations of that coming into the international scene in terms of how you're trying to tackle fraud and economic crime?
Yeah, so I guess the kind of good news is it hasn't rocked our world massively. Yes, and as you say, so it's 2 months in, and that administration will prioritise what its crime problems it wants to focus on are. I mentioned money laundering earlier, so money laundering, big aspects of that are proceeds of drugs. The American system is very interested now in tackling cartels and organised drug criminals. So there's still money laundering happening within there. So it might be different predicate offences that move around. The money laundering mission and strategy around it, obviously that will shift and change, and everyone's sort of working out where the land is going to lie. Probably more likely to have impact in terms of types of investigations, the way that the system works. When it comes to fraud, we work really closely with Americans. We actually work across the English-speaking world because, as I said earlier, if you have an English-speaking nation, it is targeted by specific criminal groups. There's a line one of our diplomats said to me once, which is, you can follow the sun with fraud. So you can wake up and defraud Australians, spend lunchtime defrauding Brits, and then your evening you can
global
defraud
business
Americans.
where the sun never sets.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't need to kind of pick a country based on that. So I haven't seen any kind of systemic shifts in approach from anywhere in the... there's been loads of elections and change through Europe, through the States, even in this country. Ultimately, fraud hasn't gone away. It is a major problem. Fraud is here to stay, and hopefully increasing.
Yeah. I think the thing that made me think that as well, I saw one of the executive orders or whatever they're called, and they talked about the fact that you can buy a green card for $5 million, and that's the sort of thing that you think, oh, that not many people have $5 million to hanging around necessarily. Money launderers do. So you wonder whether there's something there that's going to with those sort of policies, whether you're going to suddenly be attracting the wrong kind of people that could then drive the wrong kind of activity. I don't know.
Yeah, and look, that's kind of a political debate which is had all the time in all democracies. Certainly, the kind of, if you really boil that down, it comes down to regulation as well. So lots of debate about how far do we regulate sectors versus growth. That's kind of a big part of the narrative as well. So I work in the bureaucracy, so my instincts is I see the benefits of regulation, but equally I can see how, from a business perspective, you're trying to run a very small business, great example, regulation doesn't necessarily enable you to innovate. So, I don't think it's a binary choice, by the way.
Yeah.
But thankfully, the reason I chose civil service when I was looking in my bedroom at jobs was because I didn't want to have to make those decisions. I'm quite happy to implement policy of government of today rather than come up with the pros and cons of it.
Yeah, fair enough. I suppose the other part linked to that is part of tackling the fraud problem, the economic crime problem, is working with some of these big tech firms. And I'm sure there's numerous examples of some great collaboration, but I just wonder whether this recent move towards less moderation and seemingly less of a collaborative sort of engagement with those with agencies, if that's something that is on your radar.
So here we have something quite unique called the Online Fraud Charter. So we have the Online Safety Act, which is Ofcom and Department of Science and Innovation, but I work with the Home Office on the Online Fraud Charter, which is 9 signatories. It's entirely voluntary, but effectively has something like 30 commitments that those businesses have said publicly they're willing to make. And the Online Fraud Charter remains extant. No one's withdrawn, no one's walked away from it. And you mentioned good practice. There is increasingly good practice by tech sector signatories across the landscape. One of those is cooperation with law enforcement. So it's not gone far enough.
Yeah.
But no one's walked away. And there is active engagement amongst tech. However, who knows where this part of the world goes, and that particular sector's relationship with governments globally is shifting. It's probably already shifted and may shift further still, but it feels like I could read the news tomorrow and it's gone. Exact.
Yeah, I mean, the optimist sort of comes back to the rules of capitalism, I suppose, which is that these companies won't want, bad shit happening on their platforms, and hopefully they'll be motivated through reputation and
customers don't want it. So people don't want to go on an online dating website and it's full of like bots and AI, because it's almost like, well, I can't tell who's real, who's not, so why just go back to the pub then, which for an online dating company is not what they want you to do. Same with any kind of seller marketplace. People know exactly the sorts of businesses I mean, but if you're selling directly to the public and you're not in a shop, they can't trust that your platform's going to clear out all the fraudulent content, or that it's going to not going to help you if you lose money. People will just stop using the platform. So consumer choice still exists. So there's not a complete monopoly on people's lives from the online world, and they can still make those choices. Where it's harder, I think, is things like, or where it might get harder, is how criminals use the platforms almost against themselves and how they circumvent controls. There's kind of an arms race. I'm trying to not talk about AI, but you're bound to want me to talk about AI. It's not yet, in our assessment anyway, become an industrialised extra tool. There's definitely intent to use it, but it's almost like it's an extra tool in the box rather than a new box, if that makes sense. So
just better quality impersonations. And
Yeah,
all that sort of
it
stuff.
will put their hit rate up rather
Yeah.
than their
Yeah.
net number of victims. I think that's probably a better way to describe it. So that might shift. There's lots of nervousness that might shift away.
Yeah.
But ultimately, be it AI, be it any kind of tech control, even a banking sector control,
Yeah.
they're constantly innovating and finding ways to get around the controls that we put in place. What's hard for governments and public sector is, can it move in as agile a way to keep pace with those sectors, which is, I'm not saying that like the first public official to ever say that. People would have been saying that for 30 years, as long as like we've been in the kind of tech era. But I just feel like the speed that AI learns, it's like how much momentum, if we saw how the internet shifted from 95 to 2005, well, what does AI look like in 2055?
Yeah, I mean, that is a perfect segue to our last sort of aspect of the conversation before we conclude. Let's transport ourselves into 2030. Where do you see the risks, and also where do you see the our ability and to tackle them?
Someone very senior to me, ex-police, gives a really good example where it used to be on a Monday morning, you'd start your walk to the train station and every single car had its window smashed and all the car radios had been stolen. And the way that stopped is the industry recognised that problem and consumers wanted to go to the product where you wouldn't get your car radio stolen. And ultimately that type of crime still happens, but it's really totally plummeted. I'll give a hopeful answer. My hope is that industry by default is hostile to fraud. Some of those tech businesses in the charter are already there. They see fraud not just as a public sector or a victim problem, but it's their problem. Like trust in its platform, or even, not necessarily appealing to their brand, like the losses that they experience directly, like not necessarily directly in that they've lost the money, unless they're refunding people, of course, but if customers are walking away because they no longer trust the product, that has a value to their margin. So, I absolutely believe, I think the financial sector is completely here already. I think the tech sector will get there, where you don't have to want to get rid of fraud. You must get rid of fraud because it's what your customer demands.
Yeah.
It is completely realistic to think that's where we are, even by 2030, where industry itself is coming up with white papers which don't all just say, hey, you should arrest loads more people, we should arrest more people, for the record. But that isn't the answer, as we've been through today in this conversation. There's lots and lots of different ways of tackling this problem, but ultimately the people who are dealing with consumers where fraudsters are using their platforms, they can have a major impact, and I don't think we've unlocked that yet. I think we're in the process, and the regulation, deregulation debate, that will go wherever policy needs to take it, but ultimately you can be deregulated and still be hostile to fraud. It's not a binary choice, in my view. So my hope is more and more businesses make those choices, not because their consumers necessarily demand it, because they see it's the right thing to do, because it is.
Yeah, and just to continue that optimism, when you think about when we think about the fears of these tools, these AI tools that will become increasingly good at impersonating, and the Gen AI tools that will just convince us ever more convincingly, those very same tools can be trained to spot the early warning signs, the hallmarks of things that are happening in an online space that may point towards fraud. We had the same conversation with a chap called Pete Spindler. He ran Operation Newtree on a previous podcast, and we've reflected on the future and the similar concern around safety online. The optimist would say that these same algorithms should be able to spot the problem,
Yes,
and halt it in its tracks rather than letting it happen. Would be an optimistic view.
I agree. AI for good is not lost on me. So yes, it does create some threat and some jeopardy, but equally it might be part of the answer to unlocking the problem.
That's actually a really good optimistic spot to finish, unless you have any other comments or reflections.
It's been a really, hopefully, an interesting conversation. It's just great to talk about it today, and thanks for coming.
Yeah, likewise. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Drone. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Drone, signing off. Thanks for listening.